What would you do if everything you had left in this world fit inside one pocket? A worn deed to a place nobody wanted. A silver dollar edges smooth from too many hopeful hands before yours. And a grief so heavy it had stopped feeling like grief at all. It had just become the air you breathed. That was Nora Calloway at 18 years old, standing on the main street of Dustfall, California in the summer of 1876. Dust on her boots, both parents in the ground, and a folded piece of paper declaring her the sole owner of a collapsed mine everyone in town called a tomb. They laughed when she bought it. The clerk, the men by the stove, the judge standing across the street who said nothing at all, just looked at the name on that deed and let something pass behind his eyes. Something cold, something calculating. Something that told her she had just picked up a secret nobody was supposed to find. She didn't know that yet. All she knew was that the mine was hers. The only thing on earth that was. So she packed what little she had, took an old mule nobody else wanted either, and walked up into those hills alone. What she found inside that mountain would take 30 years of buried truth and bring the most powerful man in the county to his knees. But first, she had to move a mountain, one stone at a time. Settle in. This is the story of Nora Calloway and the ground that remembered everything. The deed was smaller than she expected. That was the first thing Nora Calloway noticed. Standing at the counter of the Dustfall County Clerk's office on a Tuesday morning in July of 1876, watching the man behind the desk scratch his pen across a form she couldn't quite read upside down, she thought, this is what the end of everything looks like. A piece of paper the size of a dinner plate. Ink the color of weak tea. And a rubber stamp that came down with a sound like a small final door closing. Thump. Done. The clerk slid it across the counter without looking at her. His fingers were ink-stained and indifferent. His vest had a button missing near the third buttonhole and a stain near the fourth that might have been coffee or might have been something worse. She noticed these things because she had learned in the past 3 weeks to notice small things. Small things were the only things left. She picked up the deed. Harlan's Hollow, mining claim, transfer of ownership. $1 paid in full. $1, her last one. She turned it over in her hands. The paper was brittle at the edges, yellowed the way old things go yellow when nobody has looked at them in a very long time. The ink on the original entry, the one recording the claim's creation, had faded nearly to nothing, like the name beneath it had been trying to disappear. Like even the paper had wanted to forget. She folded it carefully, tucked it into the pocket of her dress next to the place where her father's watch used to sit before she'd sold it to pay the doctor who hadn't saved him anyway. "You know what that place is," the clerk said. Not a question, more like a warning he felt obligated to issue but didn't expect to matter. been collapsed since 46. Killed the man who dug it. Nothing down in that shaft but 30 years of bad luck and loose rock. Nora looked at him. He looked back. "I know," she said. She walked out. The men loafing near the door didn't bother to lower their voices. "That the Calloway girl orphaned, I heard. Both of them, inside of 2 weeks. Lord bought that hollow, the old Hearn claim." A pause. Then somebody laughed, short and dry. The kind of laugh that isn't really humor. Just the sound people make when they don't know what else to do with themselves. Nora kept walking. Her father had a saying about that kind of laughter. He said, "Let it blow past you like the wind off the flats. It sounds like something, but it doesn't move anything that matters." Edmund Calloway had a lot of sayings. She missed them so much it was almost physical, like a bruise in a place she couldn't reach. The sun was already hard and bright and unforgiving by 9 in the morning, the way the California summer sun gets when it's decided not to be poetic about anything. She stood on the main street of Dustfall and took a breath of air that tasted of dust and horse and the faint memory of the sawmill that had closed 2 years back. The town was mid-sized and fading, the kind of place that had been more important once. You could feel it in the way the building stood a little too wide for the street built for a population that had since thought better of the whole enterprise and left. She had nowhere to go. That was the simplest way to say it. After the doctor and the undertaker had been paid after the small debts at the hardware store, and the feed merchant had been settled, because Edmund Calloway was a man who paid what he owed, and she was going to honor that if it killed her. After all of it, she had exactly $1 and the clothes on her back and her father's pickaxe leaning against the wall of an empty cabin that wasn't hers anymore because the man who owned it needed it back by the end of the month. She could have gone east, she supposed, or south. She could have found work as a domestic somewhere, washing other people's dishes, folding other people's sheets, being invisible in the background of someone else's life. She thought about that for approximately 4 seconds. Then she had gone to the county clerk's office and asked to see the claims ledger. It wasn't a plan exactly. It was more like instinct. The instinct of a girl who had grown up watching her father read rock the way other men read newspapers, patiently, with attention, looking for what the surface wasn't saying. The claims ledger was a graveyard. Page after page of abandoned dreams, claims marked forfeit names crossed out in thick black ink. Most of the entries were worthless, played-out ground legal ghosts that the county wanted off its books. But she went through it slowly. Her father's voice in the back of her mind, "Don't rush a ledger, and don't rush a seam. Both of them will show you something if you give them enough time." She was on the 4th page when she saw it. Harlan's Hollow, $1. She looked at it for a long moment. She knew the name. Everybody in the county knew the name. The story of Gideon Hearn and his foolish obsession was the kind of story people told to greenhorns and children as a warning. The man who went too deep. The man who chased a phantom vein all the way into an early grave. The mine that collapsed on him and stayed collapsed because there was nothing in it worth the trouble of clearing. Gideon's Folly, they called it, though most people couldn't even remember Gideon's name anymore. It was just the folly, the hole in the hill, the monument to foolishness. $1. She put her finger on the entry. That one, she said. The clerk chuckled. She would remember that chuckle for a long time afterward. The particular quality of it, the way it assumed the outcome before she'd even begun. The hollow girl that claim is 30 years old. The shaft is buried under God knows how many tons of rock and shale. You'd be buying a headstone is all. She placed the $1 on the counter. I know, she said again, because maybe she was. Maybe that's exactly what it was. A headstone for everything, for her parents, for the life she'd expected to have, for the version of herself that had existed 6 weeks ago before the fever came, before she learned how fast everything can just stop. A headstone for $1 felt like an honest transaction. Thump. The rubber stamp came down, and she was the owner of a collapsed mine and 30 years of other people's laughter. She was outside with the deed folded in her pocket when she felt it. A gaze. Not the idle stares of men with nothing better to do. This was specific, deliberate, the kind of attention that has weight to it. She turned her head slowly. Across the street in front of the courthouse stood Judge Harlan Voss. She knew him by sight the way you know certain landmarks. The bank bore his name above the door. The hotel had been built with his money. He owned the largest spread in the county and the most reliable route for the Eastern Mail contract, and quietly through instruments so layered, most people never thought to trace them a great deal more besides. He was a large man, broad through the shoulder with silver hair, and the kind of face that had learned early how to look reasonable. Always reasonable, always measured. The voice of a man who had never needed to raise it. He wasn't speaking now. He was just looking at her, and then slowly, with a deliberateness that felt like a message, his gaze dropped to the pocket where she'd tucked the deed. He knew. She didn't know how. She'd only just, but he knew. She could see it in the way his face didn't change at all. Because a face that doesn't change when it should is telling you something. He looked up, met her eyes, smiled, nodded once the way you nod to acknowledge something you've already categorized, and filed away. Then he turned and went back inside. Nora stood on the street in the July heat and told herself the chill she felt was not a chill. It was just the wind off the mountains, the same wind that always came down in the mornings. It was not the wind. She turned and walked toward the general store. She had supplies to see about. The man behind the counter at the general store had the face of someone who had extended credit to too many people and didn't intend to do it again. She understood that face. She'd seen her father negotiate with versions of it for years. She set his pickaxe on the counter, the good one, the one with the steel head forged in Sacramento, and the hickory handle dark with years of honest work, and watched his expression shift from wariness to interest. "I need to trade," she said. Before he could answer, a voice came from the back of the store. "Her credit is good." Silas Pruitt stepped out from between two shelves of canned goods, his hat in his hands, his face a landscape of deep creases, and something that looked like guilt dressed up as kindness. He was 62 years old and built like a man who had spent those years doing hard things in hard country. He had been her father's closest friend, the kind of friend that men like her father kept close and trusted absolutely and didn't talk about much because the trust was just understood. He set money on the counter, enough for flour coffee, a side of bacon candles rope. He didn't ask what she was planning. He already knew. The whole town already knew. He walked her outside. They stood in the thin strip of shade beside the building, and he looked at the deed when she showed him, his eyes moving slowly over the faded text. "Harlan's Hollow," he said. "Harlan's Hollow," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment that went on longer than she expected. Something moved behind his eyes. Something she couldn't name yet. Something that looked from a certain angle like a man remembering. "Your father ever talk about that claim?" he said. "No, you." Another pause, shorter this time. "He said some ground is just sad. Said it was best to leave sad ground alone." Nora watched his face. "He also said sad ground usually has a reason for being sad." Silas looked at her then. Really looked at her. And for just a moment, she saw it, the thing behind the kindness, the weight under the words. And then he looked away and cleared his throat and said nothing. He led her to the livery, to a stall at the far end, where a gray muzzled mule stood in the cool dimness, with the patient stillness of an animal that had outlasted a great many human dramas and fully expected to outlast more. "This is Job," Silas said. "He's slow, but he's steady, and he knows how to carry weight without complaining." He handed her the lead rope. She took it, looked at the mule. The mule looked back at her with eyes that were ancient and brown, and she thought unexpectedly kind. "Thank you, Silas," she said. He nodded, started to say something else, stopped. "Nora," he said finally. Just her name. The way you say something when you want to follow it with something important, and then realize the time isn't right and the words aren't ready. "I know," she said, for the third time that morning. She clicked her tongue, and Job fell into step beside her, and she walked out of Dustfall, leading a mule she didn't own toward a mine nobody wanted, with $1 she'd already spent, and a grief she hadn't figured out how to put down yet. The road out of town ran west before it turned north. and it took her past the low scrub and dry grass of the flat before beginning to climb into the hills where the ponderosa pines started and the air changed, cooled, smelled like something other than dust and ambition and the particular exhaustion of a place that has seen better times. She was passing the creek, crossing the one with the flat rocks where the water ran shallow and cold even in July when she saw the woman. Old. Not fragile, old, but deep old. The kind of old that sits in the body differently, like something has settled all the way down. She was seated on a rock beside the water hands loose in her lap, watching Nora approach with the particular patience of someone who had been watching for a while. Ara. Nora knew her by sight. Most people in the county did at least a little. She was Miwok had lived in these hills longer than any account anyone in Dustfall could give, and she came into town rarely and on terms entirely her own. People had opinions about her the way small town people have opinions about anyone who doesn't require their approval. Nora's father had spoken of her with something that looked like respect. Ada watched her stop, watched Job stop beside her, said nothing for a long moment that held its shape. "That hill," she said finally. Her voice was low and steady, like water moving under ice. "It doesn't forget. It holds things." A pause. "It has been waiting for someone patient enough to listen." Nora looked at her, felt the words land in a way she couldn't quite account for. Not like a warning, more like a confirmation, like something that had been trying to form itself in the back of her mind had just been handed its proper shape. She nodded. Ada nodded back. Nora clicked her tongue and Job moved forward, and she climbed up into the hills. She didn't look back. The trail narrowed as she climbed from a wagon road to a path to something that was really just the memory of a path, a thinning of the scrub that suggested human intention without quite committing to it. The sound of the town fell away. The sound of the road fell away. There was just the slow, steady beat of Job's hooves, the wind in the high pines, the distant call of a hawk somewhere above the tree line. She had been walking for nearly 2 hours when she saw it. Harlan's Hollow. She stopped. She had known intellectually that it was bad. The clerk had said, common knowledge said, 30 years of everyone agreeing that the place was a ruin said. But knowing something intellectually and standing in front of it are two separate experiences. It was a wound. That was the only word for it. Not a collapse, not a slide, a wound. A massive hemorrhage of earth and shale that had poured down the hillside and swallowed the mine's entrance whole, burying it under what looked like a small mountain of fractured rock and red-brown dirt. A few timbers jutted out of the debris gray and splintered like the ribs of something very large and very dead. The vegetation around the perimeter was thin and wrong, the kind of growth that comes up in disturbed ground, pale and tentative. No birds, no wind here. The pines stopped 100 yards back, and the air around the hollow just sat flat and still and oddly cold for July. Job pressed his nose against her shoulder. She put her hand on his neck without looking at him. The scale of it hit her all at once. One girl, one pickaxe. This. She was a cup standing in front of an ocean and considering the logistics of emptying it. For a long time, she just stood there. She thought about her father sitting at the kitchen table after bad days, face gray with dust hands that shook slightly from the hours of work. He would sit and say nothing, and her mother would sit across from him and say nothing too. And somehow, that nothing was the most sustaining thing in the room. And then morning would come, and he would pick up his tools. "The rock doesn't care if you're tired," he used to say. "It only cares if you show up." She chose a flat area 50 yards from the debris pile. It was sheltered on two sides by a limestone outcropping and level enough for sleeping. She unpacked Job, methodically rubbed his back where the load had pressed, and let him pick at the sparse grass along the rock's edge while she set up camp. Small fire. Coffee boiled in a tin. Bacon she ate without tasting. The stars came out enormous and cold and unhurried in the way stars are when there's no town glow to compete with. The wind moved through the pines 100 yards away, a sound like a long, slow breath, like the mountain breathing. She lay on her back and looked up. She was so afraid, not of the work, not of the wilderness or the solitude or even the dark, afraid that it meant nothing, that she would spend everything she had left, her strength, her weeks, the last reserves of herself on a pile of rock that was exactly what everyone said it was. A tomb. A monument to someone else's foolishness, and that she would come out the other side with nothing, not even the dollar, not even the grief maybe, because she had heard that grief, if you let it, eventually stops being grief and becomes something else, something flatter. She was afraid of that too. She thought about the dead man, Gideon Hearn. She didn't know anything about him except the story everyone told, that he had been obsessive, foolish, that he had chased a phantom seam all the way into his own grave, that the mountain had killed him, that there was nothing there. But the claim price was $1. And Harlan Voss, a man who owned half the county and had no known interest in worthless ground, had looked at the name on her deed with eyes that knew exactly what they were seeing. Why would a powerful man pay attention to a worthless mine? She didn't sleep easily, but she slept. And in the morning, she picked up her father's pickaxe and walked to the wall of debris and began. The first 3 days were pure brutality, not dramatic brutality, the unglamorous kind, the kind that involves moving one rock, then the next, while the sun moves overhead with absolutely no sympathy, and the pile in front of you does not visibly change. Her hands blistered, and the blisters broke, and new ones formed beneath. Her back ached in a way that was less like pain and more like a constant low conversation her body was having with itself about poor choices. She established a rhythm. Up before the light softened to morning. Coffee, a bite of something, then work. Job would stand in the shade of the outcropping and watch her with the equanimity of a creature who has long since made peace with the inexplicable behavior of humans. She would talk to him sometimes, not full sentences, just words, the names of things, small reports. Rock, she would say, tossing one. He would flick an ear. Another rock, both ears. It wasn't conversation, but it wasn't nothing. She kept to the edges of the slide at first, the way her father had taught her. You don't charge a collapsed face, you peel it. Start at the margins where the material is looser, and let the center work itself clear. It was slow. She was moving perhaps a ton a day with a shovel, her 2 hands, and a mule. The mine had possibly 10,000 tons of material in front of it. The math was not encouraging. She didn't do the math. She moved the next rock. On the 4th day, Caleb Strand appeared. She heard the horse before she saw him. Coming up the trail from the valley, unhurried the particular sound of a horse ridden by someone who is comfortable on horseback and knows it. She set her shovel down and straightened and waited. He was around 40, lean and dark-browed, with a hat tilted back in a way that managed to look casual and watchful at the same time. He swung down from his horse with the ease of a man who had spent most of his adult life in the saddle, and he smiled at her from 20 feet away. It was the kind of smile that has learned to serve multiple functions. "Miss Calloway," he said, like he'd known her name all along, which he had. She said nothing. "Hot day to be working." He surveyed the debris field with an expression of mild sympathetic concern, the kind a person wears when they are performing sympathy rather than feeling it. "Judge Voss asked me to ride up. Pay his respects. Your father was known to him," he said. "My father was known to most people," she said. "He was a friendly man." Strand nodded slowly. "The judge wanted me to let you know, out of consideration for your situation given your recent losses, he'd be willing to take this claim off your hands. He knows it's not much, but he could offer $50. $50. 50 times what she'd paid for a worthless, collapsed mine. She looked at Strand. "Why?" she said. He blinked, just once, just enough to tell her she'd found the seam. "Sentiment, I suppose," he said. "He's a generous man. Tell the judge I'm not interested in selling." Something shifted behind Strand's eyes. It moved fast and was gone before she could name it. But it was there. "He said to give you a few days to think on it. No pressure, just an offer." "I've thought on it," Nora said. Strand looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he put his hat forward, nodded once, and rode back down the trail. She watched him go. $50. She turned back to the debris pile and picked up her shovel. Why would a generous man offer $50 for a worthless hole in the ground? She dug faster. It was on the 6th day that the shovel struck something that didn't belong. She almost missed it. She was tired, her movements slightly mechanical by mid-afternoon, the shovel working with the automatic quality of long repetition. She was clearing debris from a section near the bottom of the face where the material had settled into a kind of compressed layer that required more effort than the loose rock above it. The blow was different. The sound was different. Not the sharp crack of rock on steel and not the dead thud of packed earth. Something between, dense, deep. A sound that had resonance under it. She stopped, crouched, brushed the surface of what the shovel had struck with her free hand. Wood, not rotted, not soft. The grain under her fingers was tight and cool and solid. She cleared more earth working with her hands, now careful. The wood emerged from the dirt like something being born of vertical post thick as her forearm, capped at the top with a clean, squared cut. The kind of cut made by a man who knew what he was building. The kind of precision you use when the thing you're building has to last. She sat back. Her heart was doing something different. It was oak. She knew it by the texture, by the weight of the sound, when she tapped it by the particular density of it under her palm. Her father had shown her the difference when she was small, pressed her hand against 2 pieces of wood, and asked her to feel what she felt. Pine is honest, he'd said. It groans before it goes. But oak holds a secret without telling you a thing. This was no support timber. Support timbers went horizontal. Support timbers ran along the ceiling of a shaft, and they were pine because pine was plentiful and pine was cheap, and a miner didn't need his ceiling beams to outlast the mine. This was vertical. This was deliberate. This was meant to stay. She sat with her hand on the post and let her mind go quiet, and then she thought, what does a man drive into the ground when he wants something to stay found? When he needs to leave a marker that will outlast a collapse? When he knows the mountain is coming down and he wants something on the other side of it to be where he left it? Oak is for hiding. She looked up at the wall of debris above her. The 30 years of settled silence. The mine that had killed its owner and given up nothing. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Harlan's Hollow, she didn't feel the weight of the odds. She felt something sharper. Something that didn't have a comfortable name, but sat in the chest the way purpose sits, not warm exactly, but alive. She started digging with her hands. She was still digging when the light failed and she couldn't see anymore. And she had to stop, not because she wanted to, but because she literally could not make out the surface in front of her. She sat by her fire that night and looked at her hands. The knuckles scraped raw, the nails broken down to nothing, the calluses that had started forming over calluses. Job stood nearby watching her the way he had taken to watching her at night with the steady attention that she had decided she was not going to assign meaning to because she was a practical girl and she did not believe in signs. Although she looked up at the mountain. Although she was going to find what he left, she thought. Whatever Gideon Hearn had built his oak frame around in the dark of a mine 30 years ago, hours or days before the explosion that had brought the hillside down on it, she was going to find it. She was going to show up. She fell asleep sitting up and woke with her back against the rock, and the fire reduced to cold ash, and the sky showing the first gray of pre-dawn above the pines. Job was standing 10 feet away, ears forward, looking toward the path. She was awake immediately, the deep country instinct of it. Eyes open, completely present, the way you get when you've been sleeping alone in wild places for enough nights. She saw them. Footprints in the damp earth beside the fire, 2 feet from where she had been sleeping. Boot prints, large and heavy. A man's. 2 sets, no one set, going one direction, toward the camp, then stopping, then turning, and going back down the trail. She stood up slowly, looked at the path. Nothing there now. She looked down at the prints, the depth of them, the stride length. A large man, moving slowly on the way in, more quickly on the way out. He had stood here, watched her sleep, decided something, left. She looked down toward the valley, toward the smear of smoke that was dustfall waking up 8 miles below. Her heartbeat was very loud in the morning quiet. Strand had not ridden up here out of sentiment. Voss did not want this land out of generosity. She turned back to the debris field, to the oak post still standing in its excavation, patient as a sentence waiting to be finished. She picked up her shovel, and she got back to work. The second oak post was 3 feet from the first. She found it on a Tuesday, or what she thought was Tuesday. The days had started to blur at the edges the way days do, when your world shrinks down to the size of a shovel blade, and the only calendar that matters is the one written in muscle soreness and callous depth. She had been on the mountain 11 days. Her flour sack was half empty. Her candle supply was down to 4. Her hands no longer hurt the way they had. At first they had moved past hurt into something more permanent. A new normal. The hands of someone who does this. The second post was identical to the first. Same oak, same vertical set, same squared cap, same deliberate precision. She stood between them, extended her arms. Her fingertips nearly reached both. 4 feet apart, give or take. She thought about that, stood very still, and thought about it the way her father had taught her to think about underground geometry. Not with excitement, with patience, with the particular discipline of imagining what you cannot yet see. 2 posts, vertical, 4 feet apart, set before the collapse, built to survive it. This was a frame, the beginning of a frame, which meant there were more. She didn't whoop, didn't celebrate, just nodded once the way her father used to nod when a seam confirmed what he'd suspected, not with surprise, but with the quiet satisfaction of a theory meeting its evidence. Then she started looking for the third. She found it 6 feet deeper into the debris. Then the fourth, parallel to the first pair set across from them at a distance of roughly 8 feet. 4 oak posts forming a clean rectangle in the belly of a 30-year collapse. 4 corners of something. A room, a passage, a hidden throat in the mountain leading somewhere the mountain was not supposed to lead. She sat on a rock and looked at what she'd uncovered and let herself understand it properly. Someone had built this before the collapse. Someone had known the collapse was coming, and someone had built a hidden entrance to survive it. The mine hadn't failed Gideon Hearn. Someone had murdered the mine, brought the hillside down on purpose, sealed whatever Gideon had found behind a wall of earth and rock, and 30 years of other people's certainty that there was nothing there. Her breath came out slow. Job pressed his nose to the back of her neck from behind, and she didn't move, and he didn't move, and they stayed like that for a moment in the thin morning air. Then Caleb Strand came back. She heard the horse at the same moment she heard the second horse. 2 sets of hooves, unhurried, the sound of men who are not concerned about being heard, because being heard is not the part they're worried about. She straightened, stood beside the excavation with her shovel in her hand and her face arranged into something neutral. Strand and another man. This one broader, younger, with the particular blankness of expression that belongs to people who are paid to do things and have learned not to think about those things too hard. Miss Calloway. Same greeting, same performance of ease. Looking like you've been working hard. I have, she said. Judge Voss wanted me to follow up. His offer stands, $50. A pause waited. He mentioned he might go as high as 60, given circumstances. She looked at him. He looked back. Why? She said. Not a question. An excavation. The same tool she'd been using on the mountain, just pointed differently. Strand smiled with his mouth only. I told you, he's a generous... Why does he want this specific ground? She said. Don't say sentiment. Don't say generosity. Tell me the actual reason or don't say anything at all. Silence. Long silence. The second man shifted in his saddle, a small movement, but she caught it. 3 days, Strand said finally. His voice had changed. The performance of ease was gone. What replaced it was quieter and considerably less comfortable. Think about it 3 more days. The offer goes up to 75 if you decide before then. He turned his horse. The other man followed. She watched them go down the trail, watched until the sound of the hooves faded. $75. 75 times what she'd paid. for a worthless mine. She turned back to the 4 oak posts standing in their excavation, patient as everything that has been waiting a very long time. "Somebody knows something," she said out loud. Job flicked both ears. "Yeah," she said. "I know." She went back to work. The nights were harder now, not because of the cold, though the cold was real. The mountain let go of the daytime heat faster than she'd expected, and by midnight, the temperature dropped enough that her thin blanket was barely adequate. Not because of the sounds, though the sounds were real too. Coyotes down in the brush, the occasional distant crash of something large moving through the pines, the particular silence of a high place that is not actually silent at all once you start listening. It was the footprints. They came every 3rd night or so. She'd established a pattern. She would look in the morning and find them, or not find them, and the nights when she didn't find them were not especially reassuring, because absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And she had started to understand that she was being monitored in a way that was designed to be felt rather than acted on. They wanted her unsteady. They wanted her to lie awake, calculating, so she made herself not calculate. She lay down and she closed her eyes, and she went through her father's teachings the way other people go through prayers, the colors of different rock formations, the sound differential between solid ground and hollow ground. When you tap it, the way water moves underground and announces itself in the vegetation above. She filled her mind with the language of the earth and left no room for fear. It worked. Mostly, except at 3 in the morning, sometimes when the wind dropped and the silence became absolute, and she would open her eyes and stare at the stars and feel the size of the thing she had walked into. Not just the mine, not just Voss, but the shape of what happened 30 years ago. The shape of a man who found something real and was killed for it and left no one behind to say it mattered. She was the only one who was going to say it mattered. That was not a comfortable thought, but it was a clarifying one. She dug during the days and thought at night, and on the 14th day she went down to Dustfall for supplies. The town felt different now, or she felt different in it, she couldn't be sure which. She walked its main street with a directness that came from weeks of solitary work, the kind of directness that develops when you've been alone long enough that social performance starts to feel like an optional extra. People looked at her. She looked back without the reflexive apology she'd had before. She got what she needed at the store, nodded to the proprietor, who nodded back with the respect that had not been there on her first visit. Word travels in small towns. Word about a girl digging alone on a mountain for 2 weeks travels particularly fast. She was about to leave when Silas caught her elbow. Outside, behind the building. His voice low and his eyes doing that thing again. The thing where they moved slightly to the side before they came back to her face. "Strand was in here yesterday," he said. She waited. "Asking questions about your father, about whether he had ever mentioned the Hearn claim to anyone, whether he'd ever been up that hill. Silas looked at his hands. I don't like the shape of that. Silas, she said. He looked up. What do you know about what happened in 46? The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. Not the silence of a man who doesn't know. The silence of a man who has been carrying something and has been waiting, maybe without knowing he was waiting for someone to ask the right question in the right way. He sat down on the back step. She sat beside him. And he told her. Gideon Hearn had come to Dustfall in the spring of 1845. Quiet man, serious. Not much for the saloon or the card tables. He was a miner, in the way that some men are miners, the way other men are preachers. It was calling, not occupation. He had staked his claim on the hollow and worked it with a patience and a precision that the other men in the district noticed and respected, even when they thought him obsessive. He found something in the late spring of 1846. He didn't say what exactly. He was not a man who talked about his finds before they were secure. But Silas had seen his face change, had seen the way Gideon started buying up the surrounding parcels acre by acre, using money he didn't seem to have had before. Quiet transactions. Careful. The kind of accumulation that suggests a man who is protecting something larger than what's already in his hand. Harlan Voss was a lawyer then, young, 26, 27, sharp as a new nail and already well connected with the county administration. One evening in September of 1846, there was an explosion. Silas was 2 miles away. He heard it. Everyone in the district heard it. A great concussive thud that rolled through the hills and scattered birds from the trees and made the horses go sideways in their stalls. The next morning, Harlan's Hollow was a landslide. Gideon Hearn was inside. Nobody questioned it, Silas said. His voice was flat and careful the way voices get when they've been rehearsing a thing for a very long time. Mine collapse. It happened. It was an accident. Gideon was known to push his shafts past safe limits. A pause. Within a week, Voss had started the legal process of claiming the surrounding parcels. The ones Gideon had been buying up. Said the transactions were incomplete or improperly recorded. Said Gideon had owed debts. He stopped. Nora looked at him. You were near the hollow that night, she said. Not a question. His jaw tightened. Silas. I was on the trail, he said, very quiet. Coming back from the Denton Claim eastern side. I was maybe a 1/4 mile down from the hollow entrance when I saw. He stopped. I saw Caleb Strand on that trail, heading up, carrying a canvas sack that had weight to it. Nora felt something go absolutely still inside her. Before the explosion, she said. Before the explosion. And you didn't. I was 23 years old. His voice cracked at the edge of it, cracked and held and cracked again. I was 23 years old, and Voss was already the most powerful man in the district, and Strand would have denied it and it was my word against his, and I didn't have. He put his face in his hands. She didn't say anything, not because there was nothing to say, because she understood with a sudden comprehensiveness that surprised her that there was no version of what she might say that would touch the weight of what he had been carrying. 30 years. Every morning of 30 years, waking up with the knowledge of what he'd seen, and the knowledge of what he'd chosen, and the slow grinding cost of that choice. She put her hand on his arm. He didn't look up. "I can't undo it," she said, "but I can finish it if I find what he left in there." A pause. "And I'm going to find it." He lifted his face. His eyes were red at the rims. "I know you will," he said. "You are your father's daughter." She squeezed his arm once and stood up and walked back to Job. She climbed back to the hollow with a different weight on her. Not heavier, different. The weight of a story that was no longer abstract. Gideon Hearn was no longer the man from the cautionary tale, the obsessive fool who dug too deep. He was a man who had found something real and tried to protect it and been murdered for it by a young lawyer with ambition and no conscience. And Silas had watched the murderer walk up that trail and said nothing, and spent 30 years being a good and kind man inside the prison of that silence. The weight of it, the ordinary human tragedy of it. She thought about it as she climbed, and she thought about Voss sitting in his courthouse, watching his town running his instruments of power with the smooth confidence of a man who has never been held to account for anything and has stopped expecting that he ever will be. That made her walk faster. She was 3 days from the back wall of the frame. She could feel it. The debris was thinning. The material she was moving now was less settled, more recent. As if the outermost edge of the original collapse had been supplemented at some point. As if someone had added to it. She couldn't prove that, but she felt it. She started rising earlier, working past the point where her muscles told her to stop. Job hauled away the debris in loaded panniers while she continued digging, and in the evenings she sat by the fire and did not think about fear. She thought about the 4 oak posts and what they were protecting. On the 18th night, the rain came. It started slowly, the way California mountain rain sometimes begins a light, tentative thing, almost apologetic. She didn't worry about it. She banked her fire and tucked in and assumed it would pass. It did not pass. By midnight, it was a different animal entirely. A full-throated late summer storm, the kind that comes down from the Sierra with a specific kind of fury, and it brought with it a wind that made the pines shout, and a rain that fell not in drops, but in solid gray curtains that turned the trail to a river and the flat ground around her camp to a shallow lake. She was sitting up, keeping herself dry under the overhang of the limestone outcropping, watching the water run off the rock in sheets when she heard it. Voices below her. down the trail. Not words, the distance and the rain took care of that, but the specific frequency of human distress. High and urgent. A woman's voice, and then a man's, and then something that sounded like a child. She was on her feet before she decided to stand. She grabbed the rope from Job's pack, lit her last good lantern, and went down the trail at a pace that was somewhere between a careful walk and a controlled fall, because the mud was deep and the dark was complete, and only the lantern carved any space out of either. She found them 200 yards down. A wagon! One wheel shattered at the axle, the whole rig tipped hard to the left, mired in mud to its belly. A horse wide-eyed and frantic in the traces. A man broad rain-soaked, fighting the horse's head with both hands and losing. A woman in the wagon bed holding a child against her chest, the child's face the particular white-gray of fever. She didn't ask. She went straight to the horse's head, got her hands up near the bridle, got her voice low and even, not the voice she used with people, but the one she used with Job, the one that didn't pretend the situation was fine, but didn't escalate it either. The horse fought her for 30 seconds, then started to still. "Get the child," she said over her shoulder. "Get her out of the wagon now while the horse is quiet." The man, he told her his name later. Morrow John, Morrow homesteader, heading for his sister's place in the valley, didn't hesitate. He lifted his wife down first, then the boy, 7 years old, burning up. Nora got the horse unhitched, led the horse and the family up the trail to the overhang with the limestone on 2 sides and what was left of her fire. She got the fire going again. It took 3 attempts. Wet hands shaking, but it caught. She gave the boy her blanket. She gave the woman the last of her coffee boiled up hot and strong. She gave the man the rope and told him to tie the horse to the lower pine so it couldn't bolt. She had almost nothing left. She gave it all. They huddled under the outcropping through the rest of the night, the 4 of them and Job, pressed together while the storm finished what it had started. The boy's fever broke around 3 in the morning. She knew it by the way his breathing changed from the tight, labored rhythm of a body fighting itself to the slow, loose exhale of a body that has decided to stop fighting and start healing. His mother felt it in the same moment. She pressed her face against the top of his head and made a sound that wasn't a word and was more true than any word Nora had heard in weeks. John Morrow looked at Nora across the small fire. "We would have perished out there," he said. She shook her head. "You would have managed," she said. He shook his head back, slowly, with certainty. She looked away into the fire, thought about Gideon Hearn, who had also been alone on this mountain with something to protect and no one coming up the trail to help. She thought about what it cost to be alone with a truth nobody else will carry. The storm broke at first light, washed clean and sharp and cold. The Morrows salvaged what they could from the wagon and John Morrow took his family down the trail on the horse, moving carefully, his wife behind him, the boy asleep against her chest. Mary Morrow stopped at the edge of the trail and turned back. "The whole town calls you a fool for being up here," she said. Nora waited. "They're wrong," Mary Morrow said, simply, like a woman stating a fact she was done being subtle about. Then she turned and was gone around the bend. Nora stood in the washed-out morning air and listened to the sound of them going. Then she turned back to look at the debris field. The rain had done something. She saw it immediately. The water running off the hillside had taken the path of least resistance, as water always does, and a portion of it had run directly through the lower edge of her excavation, the section she'd been working on yesterday before the storm hit. The water had carved into the debris soft and relentless, doing in a night what she'd have taken 3 more days to do with a shovel. And in the lower right corner of the excavation, where the debris had been thinnest and the water had cut deepest, a shadow. Not the shadow of earth, not the shadow of rock, the shadow of a gap, an opening, 3 inches wide, maybe 4. The rain had torn the last layer of material away from something behind it and left this small, dark, exhaling crack in the face of the mountain. She crossed to it in 6 steps, crouched, put her face close. Cold air breathed out of it, dry. Absolutely dry, which should have been impossible after a night of rain, but was its own kind of proof this space was sealed from the water. Had been sealed from everything. The air tasted of stone and deep time, and the particular stillness of a place that has not been entered in 30 years. She picked up the pry bar. It took 40 minutes. The gap was narrow and the material around it was compressed, and she had to work slowly to avoid bringing more of the debris face down on herself. But piece by piece the opening grew. 6 inches, 8, a foot. She moved each stone with deliberate care and set it aside rather than letting it fall, and the pile of cleared material grew around her feet, while the opening in front of her grew from a shadow to a real dark space, wide enough to fit through. She lit the second to last candle, held it up to the gap. The flame did not gutter. The air inside was still. She looked at Job. He looked back at her. "Wait here," she said, and she went in. The chamber was small, smaller than she'd imagined, smaller than a bedroom. The walls were raw stone chiseled with the careful marks of a man working alone over a long time. The ceiling was low enough that she had to bend slightly. The air was close and cold and perfectly preserved in the way of sealed spaces undisturbed by seasons or years, or the slow movement of the world outside. There was nothing decorative about the space, nothing carved or marked or annotated. Gideon Hearn had not been a sentimental man. He had been a practical one. The chamber was functional, a vault, a hiding place built with the knowledge that it needed to outlast whatever was coming. In the center of the floor sat a tin lockbox, rectangular, unremarkable. The kind of box a hardware merchant might sell for keeping accounts or deeds or correspondence. Dull with dust, its surfaces furred with the fine particles of 30 years of absolute stillness. She knelt. Her hands were not steady. She noticed this without judgment. They had earned the right to shake. She lifted the lid. The gold was the first thing. Of course it was. Half the box at least filled with raw ore, not dust, not flake, but solid pieces of the real thing, heavy and irregular, ranging in size from a bean to something that filled her whole palm when she lifted it. The candlelight moved across the surfaces and threw back a warm yellow light that had no business being as beautiful as it was. She set the pieces aside one by one until she reached the bottom layer. Oilcloth, a tight bundle tied with cord. She untied it. Documents, a sheaf of them folded together and preserved by the cloth with a care that spoke of a man who understood what they were worth. The first were assay reports, 3 of them from an office in Sacramento she didn't recognize, not the Dustfall assayer, not any office with Voss connections. Independent. The figures on the pages made her read them twice and then a third time because her mind kept insisting it had misread the first 2. The vein running under Harlan's Hollow was not a modest find, not a moderate find. It was one of the richest strikes documented in the Northern Sierra. Properly worked, the reports noted in their dry professional language, it would yield returns in the hundreds of thousands over its productive life. Hundreds of thousands. She set the reports down. The next documents were land transfers, parcel purchases executed one by one in the months before the collapse. Gideon Hearn buying the surrounding ground systematically. Every one of them properly recorded signatures witnessed transactions complete. Not incomplete, not improperly filed, complete and legitimate. Voss had lied when he'd claimed otherwise. He had lied, and nobody had looked closely enough to catch him, and 30 years had buried the lie under the same weight that buried everything else. She set those down too. The last document in the stack was a single folded sheet. She opened it, a map, hand-drawn, the lines precise and small. The hand of a man who was accustomed to drafting underground layouts with accuracy. It showed the vein in cross-section, the direction of the seam, the estimated depth, the projected extension of the ore body into the surrounding parcels. A technical document, the kind of thing you draw when you are planning a serious long-term operation and you want everything recorded. In the upper right corner, in small, neat letters, was a name. Not Gideon Hearn, Harlan Voss. She stared at it. This was not Gideon's map. This was Voss's map. The same hand that signed the contracts. The same small, precise lettering she had seen on the deed transfer documents. Voss had drawn this map before Gideon died. Voss had known the exact value and extent of the vein. Not because he discovered it because Gideon told him, or because he had someone watching Gideon's work. He had known what was under that ground before he sent Strand up the trail with a canvas sack. And Gideon had somehow gotten his hands on it. And Gideon had hidden it here in this vault with the assay reports and the land deeds as a complete picture, as a case, as the kind of thing you build when you know you are not going to be alive to testify yourself and you need the evidence to speak without you. Nora sat back on her heels. The candle flickered. There was one more thing at the very bottom of the box, an envelope. Sealed, or it had been once the wax seal had cracked and the flap had loosened over the years. But it had kept its contents dry. She lifted it. The handwriting on the front was rough. Not Gideon's usual precision. The handwriting of a man writing quickly, urgently, in the time he had left. She opened it. One sheet, one side written, the other blank. Dated the 14th of September, 1846, one day before the explosion. She read it. She read it once quickly, and then sat still for a long moment, and then read it again slowly. Gideon Hearn had written to his sister. He had written about Voss, about the conversations that had shifted from business to threat, about the documents and deeds and the map that had come into his possession and that he had understood immediately were a death sentence if Voss knew he had them. He had written about building the chamber, about the oak frame, about his intention to put everything inside it where the mountain would keep it. He had written, "I do not expect to walk out of this mine again. Voss is not a man who leaves problems unsettled. But I have built this place to last. I have built it for the person who comes after me. I don't know who that will be or when. But I believe the earth holds things for the right moment. I believe in the patience of honest ground." She read that line again. The patience of honest ground. She held the letter in both hands in the cold chamber, and the candle threw shadows against the stone walls, and 30 years of unjust silence pressed around her on every side. And then she folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, placed the envelope with the map and the deeds and the assay reports, wrapped everything back in the oilcloth, retied the cord with steady hands, stood up, came back out through the gap into the morning air. Job raised his head. She stood in the pale, clean light of the day after the storm. The hills around her washed to a bright, wet green. Dustfall invisible in the valley below. The whole world quiet after the night's noise. She held the oilcloth bundle against her chest. She knew what she was carrying, and she knew that the moment she carried it down that mountain, everything would change. For her, for the town, for the man in the courthouse who had run 30 years of the county on the foundation of a lie and a landslide and one night's work with a canvas sack. She also knew that Strand would be watching the trail, and that Voss, when he understood what she had found, would not bother with $75 anymore. She looked at Job. He looked back with his ancient eyes.
"We need to be careful," she said. He exhaled slowly through his nose, a long, considered breath. She tucked the bundle deep into the bottom of his left pannier underneath the rope and the empty flour sack and the spare horseshoe nail she'd been carrying since week 1. Covered it, adjusted the weight. Then she made a copy. It took 3 hours and most of her remaining candles. Working in the chamber page by page, she transcribed the key figures from the assay reports and the names from the land deeds and the date and the substance of Gideon's letter in her own hand on the backs of the flour sack paper she used for her camp log. Not perfect, not legally binding on its own, but a record, a backup, a second voice if the first was taken from her. She tucked the handwritten copy into the inner layer of her clothing, next to her skin. Then she banked the fire, shouldered her pack, took Job's lead rope, looked once more at the 4 oak posts standing at the threshold of the hidden chamber. 30 years of stubborn patience, standing exactly where Gideon Hearn had set them. She thought he built this for the right person. She didn't know if she was the right person, but she was the person who showed up. She started down the mountain. She did not take the main trail. That was the first decision. The main trail was the obvious route, the worn path that switchbacked down the southern face and deposited you at the edge of Dust Falls Main Street within sight of the courthouse. The obvious route was also the route Strand would be watching. She knew this the way she knew most things now, not from proof, but from pattern, from the shape of how Voss operated. Careful, methodical, always 3 moves ahead of where you thought he was. So she took the western ridge instead. It was harder ground, steeper in places, rocky underfoot, the kind of descent that required attention at every step. Job navigated it with the unhurried competence of an animal who has spent decades learning that the slow path is usually the safe one. She let him set the pace. She kept her eyes on the trail ahead and her mind on what she was carrying, and she did not let herself think too far forward, because forward was a country she couldn't fully see yet, and thinking about it would only borrow trouble she hadn't earned. The bundle in Job's pannier, the copy against her skin. 2 voices for the same truth. That was enough. It had to be enough. The western ridge added 2 hours to the descent. By the time the ground flattened and the scrub oak gave way to the dry grass of the valley floor, the sun was already well past midday and the town of Dustfall was resolving itself out of the afternoon haze to her left. She circled wide, came in from the north end of town where the livery and the feed merchant and the rougher boarding houses sat away from the courthouse end, away from the bank, away from anywhere that Harlan Voss had eyes she knew about. She had thought on the mountain about who to find first. The sheriff was in Voss's pocket. She had understood this for weeks, from the way people talked around it, never directly, always in the careful language of a town that has learned which subjects require that kind of care. The sheriff would take the documents, and she would never see them again. And by morning, there would be some clean explanation for why the Calloway girl had made up stories about a powerful man. The circuit judge was due in 3 weeks. 3 weeks was too long, which left Davy's Merritt. She knew of him from Silas, a lawyer out of Sacramento come to Dustfall on business involving a land estate in the eastern part of the county. Staying at the hotel. Silas had described him as a man who operated by the exact letter of the law and found personal satisfaction in applying that letter to people who had assumed the law wouldn't reach them. That was what Silas had said. And Silas, who was not a man given to overstatement, had said it with the particular emphasis of someone communicating something important through the gap between the words. She tied Job at the post behind the hotel, stood for a moment in the alley. Her heart was loud. Not from the descent, from the understanding settling over her fully now, for the first time, of what she was about to do. Not the finding was done. This was the next part. The part where you carry the truth into a room full of people and set it down and ask the room to reckon with it. The part her father's pickaxe could not do. The part that required something else. She straightened her back, walked in. The hotel dining room held 4 tables, a sideboard with a coffee pot that smelled like it had been on the heat too long, and 3 guests, one of whom was reading, and 2 of whom were eating, in the companionable silence of people who have been traveling together long enough to run out of conversation. Davy's Merritt was the one reading. She knew him immediately, not from description, from posture. He sat with the contained alertness of a man who is never fully off duty. 50s, gray at the temples, a face that had learned patience but not complacency. His jacket was good quality and well kept and slightly dusty from the road, which told her he had arrived recently and had not yet decided whether Dustfall was worth pressing his jacket for. She walked to his table. He looked up. She set the oilcloth bundle beside his plate. "I believe this requires your attention," she said. He looked at the bundle, then at her, taking in the state of her, the work-worn clothes, the broken nails, the particular quality of exhaustion that comes from weeks of hard physical labor and not enough sleep. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted. A sharpening. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. She sat. He untied the cord, unrolled the oilcloth, looked at what was inside for a moment without touching it. Then he picked up the first essay report and began to read. The dining room continued around them. The 2 companions murmured to each other. The coffee pot hissed. Somewhere outside, a horse went by at a trot. Nora sat with her hands in her lap and watched Merritt read and did not speak because he didn't need her to speak. He needed her to let him think. He read slowly. He was not a fast reader in the performative sense. He did not turn pages quickly to signal comprehension.
He read the way her father had taught her to read rock, with attention, with the understanding that what you miss on the first pass may be exactly the thing that matters. He reached the land deeds. He read those more slowly. He reached the map. He stopped, stared at it for a long moment, looked up at her. Where did you find this?
"Inside the mine," she said, "behind a false wall, inside a chamber Gideon Hearn built before the collapse."
Before. He knew it was coming. He built the chamber to survive it, and he put everything inside. Merritt looked back at the map, at the name in the upper right corner. "How old are you?" he said. 18. He set the map down, picked up the last document, the envelope. He handled it carefully, the way you handle something that is both fragile and volatile. He unfolded the letter and read it, and she watched his face, and what she saw there moved through several registers, concentration, and then a kind of grimness, and then something that looked briefly like sorrow. The particular sorrow of a man who deals in law and understands exactly what it means when law fails the people it was built to protect. He folded it back, set it down, looked at her steadily. A man who had this much evidence against him, he said, and had 30 years to build his position in this county. A pause, not hesitation, calculation. He is going to come at this hard. I know, she said. He will try to discredit the documents. I know. He will try to discredit you. I know. Merritt looked at her for a moment longer, and then almost imperceptibly, something in his face shifted. Not into warmth exactly, into a different kind of respect, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. The man who built those documents was very thorough, he said, and the woman who found them is... He stopped, selected the word carefully. Formidable. She didn't respond to that. There wasn't time for it, because the door of the dining room opened, and Caleb Strand walked in. He saw her immediately. Of course he did. His eyes went to her, then to the table, then to the documents spread between her and the lawyer. His face ran through its calculation in about 2 seconds flat, and came out the other side with an expression that had abandoned all performance of civility. He turned and walked back out. Merritt watched the door. How long do we have? He said, not a question. Less than an hour, she said. He'll go straight to Voss. Then we need Silas Pruitt right now. He was already standing, already gathering the documents with the brisk economy of a man who has practiced managing crises before they become catastrophes. You said he was a witness. He saw Strand on the trail, the night of the explosion, before it. Merritt looked at her. And he's willing to say so. She thought of Silas on the back step with his face in his hands. 30 years of a man living inside the prison of his own silence.
She thought of the way he had said, "I know you will. You are your father's daughter." "Yes," she said. "He is." They found Silas at the store. He was behind the counter, and when he saw Merritt beside Nora, his face went through the same calculations Strand's had, but in the opposite direction. Strand's face had closed. Silas's opened, as if a window had been unlatched after a very long time. Merritt spoke to him for 4 minutes. Direct, precise, no excess. Told him what was in the documents. Told him what his testimony would mean. Told him what it would cost, not in legal terms, but in personal ones. Because a man of Silas's age, in a town this size, standing up against the most powerful man in the county, was not a small thing. It was the kind of thing that could not be undone. Silas listened. Then he said, "Tell me where and when." Merritt nodded once. "Tomorrow morning, the courthouse steps. Public." "Public," Silas repeated. "Public," Merritt said again, firm. "The only thing that protects all of you is that every person in this town hears it at the same time. No closed rooms, no private hearings, no version of this that Voss can manage before it reaches the street." Silas looked at Nora. She looked back. He nodded. She did not sleep that night. Not from fear exactly. Fear had been present for so long now that it had become like the altitude, something you accounted for and moved through, rather than something that stopped you. She lay on the narrow bed in the boarding house room she'd paid 2 nights for, with money Merritt had lent her without being asked, and she looked at the ceiling and she thought about the morning. The courthouse steps. She had imagined this moment. If she was honest, she had imagined something like it somewhere back in the early days on the mountain. Not clearly, more like a direction, a bearing. The way miners talk about following a seam, you don't always know where it ends, but you follow the evidence and trust the ground. But thinking about it, and lying in a bed the night before, it were 2 different experiences. She thought about Gideon Hearn. She thought about the chamber he had built, the oak posts he had driven into the earth with a precision that outlasted the explosion and the landslide, and 30 years of everyone insisting there was nothing there. She thought about him writing that letter by candlelight, knowing what the next day would bring, writing for a sister who might never receive it, about a truth that might never be spoken. "I believe the earth holds things for the right moment." She pressed her hand flat against the mattress, felt the solid resistance of it, the ordinary, unheroic weight of a real thing under her palm. She thought, "I don't know if I'm the right person." And then she thought, "But I'm the person who showed up." And that had to be enough. She was dressed before dawn. She went to the livery, gave Job the last of the dried apples she'd been saving since week 2 on the mountain, the piece she'd been carrying in her left pocket through every difficult day as a kind of private promise. He ate it with the methodical appreciation of an animal who accepts good things without making a fuss. She pressed her forehead briefly against the side of his neck.
felt the warm, steady heat of him. "Thank you," she said. He exhaled slowly. She walked to the courthouse. Merritt was already there, standing on the steps in the early morning light with the documents in his hand and the particular stillness of a man who has chosen his ground and planted his feet. Silas stood beside him, older looking in the morning than he had been the evening before, but upright, present, wearing his good coat, the one she'd only seen him wear to funerals. People were beginning to appear, not because they knew exactly, but because Dustfall was the kind of small town where a lawyer standing on the courthouse steps at 7 in the morning with a sheaf of papers has a quality of announcement to it. A woman coming from the bakery stopped. A man from the feed merchants. 2 from the hardware store. A handful more from the saloon where the early drinkers and the late card players had reached the same hour from opposite directions. They gathered, the way people gather when something is about to happen that they don't fully understand, but recognize as significant. The instinct for witness, as old as any courthouse. Merritt did not wait for a crowd. He began. His voice was clear and carried well in the morning air. He read from the assay reports first. The figures, the dates, the name of the independent office in Sacramento. He read them without editorial, without drama. Just the numbers, just the facts, just the documented reality of what Harlan's Hollow had contained 30 years ago and still contained now. The small crowd grew. He read from the land deeds. Gideon Hearn's purchases properly executed, properly recorded. The surrounding parcels. The careful accumulation of a man building something real. Then the subsequent claims by Harlan Voss that those transactions were incomplete. The transfer of the land at pennies on the dollar to a man who had just been appointed to the county bench. More people, word traveling the way it does. The way it always does in small towns where the air itself seems to carry information. People coming out of doors they hadn't intended to come out of. Stopping on their way somewhere else. Collecting on the edges of the street. Then Merritt read the map. He described it first. The vein in cross-section. The technical precision of the draftsmanship, the projected yield. And then he read in a clear, unhurried voice the name in the upper right corner. Harlan Voss. The name landed on the crowd like a stone in still water. Rings of reaction spreading outward. Murmurs. A sharp intake of breath from somewhere. The particular silence of a group of people collectively revising a picture they thought they understood. Then the door of the courthouse opened. Voss. He was dressed as he always was, well precisely the appearance of authority maintained down to the last detail. He came down the steps with the measured confidence of a man who has walked into difficult rooms before and walked out the other side intact. His face was arranged in its familiar expression. Reasonable, measured, slightly pained. He looked at Merritt. He looked at the crowd. And then he looked at Nora, standing at the base of the steps to his left. And for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. Not into guilt, not into fear, into something older and colder. The look of a man who has built an empire on the assumption that certain people do not matter enough to be a threat, and who is in the process of revising that assumption. He recovered immediately.
"Mr. Merritt,"
He said, his voice exactly as it always was,
that low, reasonable boom.
the voice of a man accustomed to being the most authoritative person in any room.
"I see we have a situation."
"We do," Merritt said.
"Not adversarially, factually. These documents—"
Voss gestured toward them with a patience that was almost convincing.
"I have no doubt the girl found something. Old papers, old claims. The Hearn estate was complicated at the time of his death. These things get muddled over 30 years. The map,"
Merritt said. Voss's chin lifted slightly.
"is in your hand."
Merritt said. Quiet, absolute.
Your drafting, your notation, your estimate of the ore body's value, made before Gideon Hearn's death, which establishes that you knew exactly what you were acquiring before you acquired it, which establishes motive and establishes premeditation.
Silence. Complete silence. The kind that happens in crowds when everyone stops breathing at the same moment. Voss looked at the map. Just for a second. The reflexive look of a man checking something he cannot help checking. And that was all. That small, involuntary movement. That fraction of a second of recognition. The crowd saw it. Every person standing in that street saw a powerful man look at a piece of paper with the eyes of someone who knows exactly what it is. But Voss recovered because he was Voss, because 30 years of practicing this particular performance had made him very good at it. The word of an 18-year-old orphan girl, he said, his voice carrying now addressing the crowd rather than Merritt. Against 30 years of service to this county, against everything I have built here, forgive me if I find the scales somewhat uneven. He was good. She had to give him that. The crowd shifted. She felt it. The small collective uncertainty that a confident, powerful voice can introduce into a room that was almost decided. Voss knew how to work a crowd. He had been doing it for 30 years. Then Silas said, "I was there." Not loud, not dramatic. The voice of a 62-year-old man saying a thing he had not said for 30 years, and finding to his apparent surprise that it came out steadier than he expected. The crowd went very still. Silas stepped forward. He didn't look at Voss. He looked at the people, his neighbors, the men and women he had lived beside and done business with and watched grow up for decades. He spoke to them directly
the way you speak to people whose respect you have earned and whose judgment you trust. He told them what he had seen on the trail on the night of September 14th, 1846. He told them simply and completely the time, the place, Caleb's strand, the canvas sack, the direction. He told them that he had not spoken in 30 years because he was afraid and because he had not believed it would matter. He told them it had cost him something every single day. His voice broke once. Near the end, he did not stop. When he finished, the silence held for a long moment. Then Voss said, "A man's faulty memory 30 years. My memory," Silas said, "is not faulty." And something in the flatness of it, the complete absence of doubt, closed a door. Voss turned to Nora. She had been waiting for this. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across the street that first morning. The same look. The measuring look. The look that categorized and filed. Except now there was something different in it. A quality she had not seen in his face before. Not fear. Not quite. But the early architecture of it. "You've made a grave mistake, girl," he said, low, private, for her alone. "You have no idea what you've started." She looked back at him, and she said, "Yes, I do." Because she did. She knew exactly what she had started. She had started the process by which the truth that Gideon Hearn had trusted the earth to keep would be returned to the light. She had started the conversation that Silas had been unable to have for 30 years. She had started the accounting that Voss had built his entire life on the assumption would never come. She had started it with $1 and a pickaxe and the stubborn refusal to believe that worthless meant empty. She reached into her coat and took out the last thing. The one thing she had not given merit. The one thing she had kept. She held it out to the crowd. Not to Voss, not to Merritt, to the crowd, to the ordinary people of Dustfall who had been living inside the architecture of a lie for 30 years without knowing the full shape of what surrounded them. It was a small photograph. She had found it tucked inside the oilcloth behind the letter, so small and so carefully folded that she had almost missed it. A man standing at the entrance to a mine, his hand on the timber frame, looking directly at the camera with the expression of someone who has decided to be very clear about where he stands and who he is. Gideon Hearn. She had not shown it to Merritt because the photograph was not evidence. It was not a legal document. It would not send Voss to prison. It would not win in any court. But it did something the documents could not do. It put a face on the silence. It said this was a real man. He stood here in this place, on this ground, and he was real, and he mattered, and what was done to him was done to a person,
not an abstraction. She passed it through the crowd, from hand to hand. People looked at it and passed it on. An old woman near the back held it for a moment longer than most. Something in her face, the particular expression of someone being returned something they didn't know they had lost. Voss watched this happen. And for the first time in 30 years, in front of the courthouse in the morning light, surrounded by the people over whom he had exercised absolute quiet control since before some of them were born, Harlan Voss had nothing to say. Not because he had run out of arguments, because the room had run out of willingness to hear them. There is a moment in certain kinds of reckoning when power stops being power. Not through force, not through any dramatic reversal, just through the quiet withdrawal of the consent that made it power in the first place. People who have been watching a performance and choosing to believe in it, choosing to accept its terms, choosing to organize their lives around its requirements, and then stopping. She watched it happen in the faces around her. The sheriff arrived an hour later. He came with the bluster of a man who intends to assert authority over a situation that has already resolved itself without him. He found Merritt with the documents, Silas with his statement already written out and witnessed by two shopkeepers who had been standing in the crowd, and Nora Calloway standing in the middle of it all, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have done the thing they needed to do and are now simply waiting for the world to catch up. The sheriff looked at Voss. Voss looked back. Something passed between them. The look of a man whose calculations have included up to this moment a reliable variable that is no longer reliable. The look of a man who has just understood that the protection he expected is not coming. Voss straightened his jacket. "I will require legal counsel," he said, to no one in particular. The sheriff, to his small credit, did not look at Nora when he took Voss's arm. He looked straight ahead, as if the act of taking that arm required the full weight of his attention and every other thing in the street had ceased to exist. They went inside. The crowd stood. Then slowly it began to dissolve. Not with noise or celebration, just the quiet dispersal of people who have witnessed something significant and need to go away and sit with it and figure out what it means for the stories they have been telling themselves about their town and their lives and the ground under their feet. Merritt found her standing on the step. "Federal marshals will be sent from Sacramento," he said. "It will take time. There will be a proper investigation. The documents will be examined by independent experts. The process is not quick." "I know," she said, "but it will not stop." He said this with the precision of a man stating a legal fact rather than offering comfort. "The evidence is irrefutable, and he knows it." She nodded. Silas came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, the same gesture as when they had stood outside the general store the morning she'd left, except different now. Less weighted. The weight was somewhere else. Distributed into the air, into the record, into the morning. He had carried it for 30 years. He had set it down. She looked at the courthouse door. Then she looked at the photograph in her hand. She had taken it back from the crowd when it came around. She looked at Gideon Hearn standing at the entrance of his mine, his hand on the timber, looking directly at her across 30 years. I believe the earth holds things for the right moment. She didn't know if she was the right person. She still didn't know that. Maybe that wasn't a question anyone got to answer about themselves. But she was the person who had shown up.
She left Dustfall the same afternoon. Not running, not fleeing, simply returning to the place that was hers. The Morrows were in town, and John Morrow found her at the livery and gripped her hand with both of his for a long moment and didn't speak because the grip said everything his voice couldn't manage. She nodded. He nodded back. Mary Morrow, standing behind him, pressed a folded cloth into Nora's saddlebag dried apple she found later, a full, generous portion of it wrapped with care. She climbed back up to Harlan's Hollow in the late afternoon light. The mountain looked different, or she looked at it differently. It was the same slope, the same rock, the same pines starting 100 yards back from the debris field, the same wound-shaped landslide, the same absence of birdsong near the entrance. But something had shifted in the quality of the silence. It was not the silence of a secret being kept. It was the silence of a secret that had been told. She went to the entrance of the chamber, stood at the threshold of the gap. She did not go back in. There was no need. The documents were with Merritt. The truth was in the world now moving through it the slow but unstoppable way. Truth moves once it has been spoken by the right person in the right room. It would do its work without her. She reached through the gap and placed the photograph inside. On the stone floor of the chamber just inside the entrance, the photograph of Gideon Hearn returned to the place he had built, returned to the ground he had trusted to keep what mattered. Then she began to fill the gap carefully with the stones she had removed. Not all the way, just enough to close it. Enough to mark a boundary between outside and inside, between the world of courts and evidence and legal process, and this small personal vault built by a serious man who had believed in the patience of honest ground. It took an hour. When she finished, she stepped back and looked at it. And then she did something she had not done since the morning her father died. She cried. Not dramatically, not with the kind of grief that performs itself, just the quiet, unglamorous release of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has finally put it down in the right place. Her face got wet, and her chest made sounds she wasn't entirely in control of, and Job pressed his enormous gray head against her back, and she put her arm around his neck, and they stood like that in the late afternoon light until it stopped. It stopped. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, looked at the closed gap, looked at the 4 oak posts still visible in the excavation, standing exactly where Gideon Hearn had driven them into the earth on the last night of his life, exactly where he'd left them, patient, steady, doing the thing they had been built to do. She thought about her father teaching her about wood, pine and oak, honest wood and hiding wood. She thought about him sitting at the kitchen table after bad days with her mother's hand in both of his. She thought about him picking up his tools the next morning, every morning. The rock doesn't care if you're tired. She thought about Silas finally setting down the thing he'd carried for 30 years. She thought about Gideon Hearn writing a letter he didn't expect anyone to read, trusting the earth with the truth he couldn't protect himself. She thought about what it means to hold something carefully when you're the only one who can. She turned, looked at the valley below. Dustfall, a smear of smoke and light in the gathering dusk. The place that had laughed at her. The place that was already changing, she knew, in ways that would take months or years to fully show themselves. Buildings and land, and the slow redistribution of power that happens when the thing an empire was built on is removed from under it. She didn't feel victorious. She had expected to feel victorious. She felt something quieter than that, something that didn't have a clean name. The feeling of having done a specific necessary thing and of being now on the other side of it. Not at an ending. At a place where one story stopped and another one hadn't quite started yet. The deed to Harlan's Hollow was still in her pocket, her $1, her last dollar, the joke purchase, the headstone, the tomb. She took it out, unfolded it, read it in the dying light. Harlan's Hollow, mining claim, transfer of ownership. $1 paid in full. She refolded it, tucked it back. Offers would come, she knew. Merritt had already said so once the investigation began, and the full extent of the vein became public. The mining consortiums would come with their representatives and their numbers and their careful, polite language for very large amounts of money. They would come, and she would listen to them, and she would consider what her father had built his life on, not money, not property, but the belief that the earth deserves to be worked honestly. That a person who stands in front of a wall of rock and doesn't turn away earns a relationship with the ground that goes beyond what can be written on a deed. She would think about that. She would take her time. She reached out and placed her palm flat against the hillside. The rock was cool under her hand, rough and real, ancient and absolutely indifferent to the small human dramas that had played out on its surface. It had been here before Gideon Hearn. It had been here before Dustfall. It would be here long after everyone who had stood on this ground had gone to their own ground. But it had held the truth when no one else would, when no one else could. She stood like that for a moment, her hand on the rock, the evening coming down around her jaw, breathing steadily at her shoulder.
the first stars beginning to show themselves in the deep blue above the pines. Then she picked up her father's pickaxe and she started thinking about tomorrow.